Welcome to part 2 of 5 Smooth Stones for Spiritual Formation. Again, what we're trying to do is lay out a set of basic axioms that you can build on to nurture spiritual formation in a variety of settings. So we're not focusing primarily on particular spiritual practices or disciplines, but instead highlighting broader principles of formation that can shape all that you do in your ministry. In our first session, we focused on the outcome or goal of formation, shaping what philosopher Charles Taylor called the social imaginary, or what Henry Mitchell called our intuitive consciousness. We want the truth of the gospel to reach not just the ideas we hold in our heads, but to our gut reactions to the world and to others and to every situation we face. This is where all that we do by way of discipleship or formation should lead to the development of a holistic, all-encompassing way of being in the world that is fundamentally Christian, where God truly is all in all. In this session, we'll begin exploring how that happens by focusing on the role of our bodies in the shaping of our spirits. I'd like to begin by describing an experience that I had not long ago. I've been away from teaching for several months, working on other projects from home, so I hadn't even been to my office. And as I thought about the prospect of returning to the classroom, to office hours, to faculty meetings, and all the rest, frankly, I felt absolutely no motivation, no interest, no energy, almost a sense of dread. Normally, I love my work. I get a kick out of organizing classes. I enjoy my colleagues, and my students are delightful. But in that moment, I just didn't have any motivation, and I felt a lurch of panic at the prospect of having to return to that work. But then one day, I stopped by the library to pick up a couple of books. I stepped from the hallway through the double doors into the open area by the circulation desk and was immediately hit by a familiar scent. The classic blend of furniture polish mixed with the dusty smell of books. I saw and felt under my feet the old brown industrial carpet. Guided by the bright fluorescent lamps overhead, I snaked through the shelves looking for the volumes I needed. After I was done, I walked down the hall and stuck my head into a classroom. I saw the whiteboard attached to the wall and the tables and rolling chairs arranged in a square. Again, it was a multi-sensory experience. Smells, sights, lighting, textures, all activating something deep within that I had forgotten. We've all experienced this. A line from a song can transport us back to an earlier moment in our lives. And it's more than just remembering the fact of that moment. It's like we relive it. Certain smells have the power to bring on strong emotions. So can physical movements. Decades ago, I rear-ended another car on a road that had become slick from a sudden summer rainstorm. All these years later, certain movements in the car will cause me to relive that terrifying sensation of sliding and the sight of that vehicle looming ahead. In the same way, standing there in the library and then in the classroom, I felt overcome with a sense of excitement for what I do. It wasn't something I produced through some cognitive effort by thinking hard. Instead, it was all of my senses working together to activate an identity that had been inscribed on my intuitive consciousness through years of bodily actions. Walking into a classroom, standing up behind that lectern, or sitting around a seminar table, reading or talking about a text, hearing the voices of students. It was all still there. All I needed to do was to put my body back in that space with all of its sensory reminders. And that took me back to my gut level sense of who I am and what I love to do. That experience illustrates how much of our identity, how much of our way of being in the world is rooted in our bodies, shaped by bodily experience. And it illustrates this axiom of spiritual formation, that spiritual formation is embodied. Now, for the past 4 centuries of Western culture, as well as Christian thought, our approach has taken us in the opposite direction, away from embodiment and toward a kind of inwardness where our ideas and intentions take center stage. We see the trend beginning in Augustine, where gratuitously stealing a pear from a neighbor's tree evokes far more guilt than decades of sexual misbehavior. It's captured in René Descartes' famous declaration, "I think, therefore I am," as if we reach the fullest expression of humanness by bracketing out the body and centering on rationality. As James K.A. Smith puts it, we've come to see humans as thinking machines. Well, as Christians, we've been socialized to see faith primarily as holding certain ideas in our heads and maybe feeling some kind of inner psychological state. We've tended to marginalize the body and our physicality, and that has robbed us of so much of the vibrant life and hope that God intended for us. If you think about it, most of the joys and pleasures we experience, certainly our encounters with beauty, these all come to us through our physical senses. And so to cut them off is to cut us off from so much of how God's glory and goodness comes to our lives. But even more, by turning away from the body, we've adopted a kind of spirituality that has often kept the deepest truths of our faith from penetrating to what Taylor called the social imaginary. We hold them as intellectual ideas, and yet sometimes they never reach to the level of our gut reactions to the world. Well, more recently, we've begun to rethink all of that. Part of that rethinking comes from exciting developments in the field of neuropsychology, which emphasizes how much of our development as persons and our sense of the world is rooted in our physical experience. That research gives us new eyes for seeing what has been there in the Bible all along. And it helps us recognize, as I did that day when I stepped into the library, that so much of our identity and way of being in the world is rooted in the repeated actions we perform in our bodies. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're learning about this connection between our bodies and everything else about us. Several years ago, the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology reported a fascinating experiment undertaken by two researchers who wanted to explore the way that the clothes we wear impact our experience of the world. So they randomly divided their test subjects into 3 groups, and then the members of each group were asked to perform a visual discrimination test. Here's how that works. Each person is shown a series of 2 pictures that are almost identical except for some minor differences, and they're asked to find as many differences as they can. And the people across the whole study all performed the same test. But here's how the groups were different. The members of the first group were shown a white coat, and they were told that it was an artist's painter's coat. And then each person wore the coat while performing the discrimination test. The second group was just shown the coat, and they were told that it was a doctor's lab coat. And they were primed to think about the symbolic associations between the coat and the intellectual abilities of a doctor. Doctors are smart, doctors are capable, doctors are discerning, and so forth. But they didn't actually wear the coat while they performed the test. They just thought about it. And then the third group was told that it was a doctor's lab coat, and they were primed to think about all the meanings associated with the doctor's lab coat, but then they did something else. Each person in the third group put the lab coat on before they performed the visual discrimination test. Well, the results were amazing. As you might expect, the subjects who wore what they thought was an artist's coat came in last. Just ahead of them were those who merely thought about the doctor's lab coat. But the group that outperformed all the others were the subjects who actually put the doctor's lab coat on. The researchers concluded that these results came from 2 things. First was the symbolic meaning of the clothes themselves. There is a difference in people's minds between a painter's coat and a doctor's lab coat. So ideas really do matter. But even more important was the physical experience of actually wearing the doctor's lab coat while performing the test. The members of that third group did more than just think about the symbolic connections. By putting the lab coat on, they actually lived those connections in the moment. Well, this is just the tip of the iceberg in this research. There's so much research that shows how integral our body is to our experience of the world. Research has shown that children learn about themselves and their world through their bodies. Such fundamental things as learning to walk or developing depth perception. They don't just think about it, they get up and start to move through the world. We also know that what happens in our bodies affects our emotions. In one simple study, half of the subjects were asked to balance a short stick, like a pencil or a pen, on their upper lips. And then the other half held the stick in their mouths long ways, the way you might when you suck on a straw. And then each person was asked to rate how funny a series of cartoons were. Well, the people with the stick on their upper lips rated the cartoons as funnier than those who held the stick in their mouths. The reason, the researchers concluded, was that the stick on the upper lip forces you to hold your face in something like a smile, whereas the stick in your mouth puts your lips in the position of frowning. So the position of your face actually changes the way that you perceive humor. Studies of trauma have shown that the memories of traumatic experiences are connected to bodily sensations and positions, so that certain movements can bring forth memories and emotional states. In his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk talks about the power of physical sensations, smells, sounds, and so forth to evoke the sense of threat that has gotten stuck in our brains. It's almost like that sensation is telling the brain it's happening again. He also talks about the ways that these might be treated with embodied therapies, various kinds of therapeutic yoga or drama or ritual, even the smiling face of another person. Over and over again, what neuroscience is telling us is that our physical existence is completely bound up with our emotional and spiritual lives. And of course, once you see this and you go to Scripture, you find over and over again evidence that living into our identity as God's children is holistic, that it involves our bodies as well as our minds, and that's how God made us. Think about what God tells the people in Deuteronomy 6 about the teachings they'd been given. Talk about them all the time, he says, but also tie them as symbols on your hands, bind them on your foreheads, so that not only will you see them constantly, but that everyone who sees you will also see them. Write them on your door frames and on your gates. These are not just in your heads, they're in your bodies, they're everywhere. And think about the ritual commands in the Old Testament, things that don't often make a lot of sense to us. For example, the prohibition against wearing fabrics made of blended materials. How that might have served as a physical reminder to live out of an unmixed devotion to God. When we come to the ministry of Jesus, we find physical, sensory experiences so much at the heart of how he forms his followers, with everything from storms to miraculous feedings to mixing dirt and spit to make a paste for a blind man's eyes, to invitations to look around at the lilies growing wild in the field. Think about how often he uses physical touch to communicate God's love. And think about all the references to physical practices and experiences in the life of the early church. Of course, there's baptism and communion. C.S. Lewis had these in mind when he once quipped that God had offered certain spiritual gifts to us only on the condition that we perform certain bodily acts. But beyond these, we find the early Christians greeting each other with a holy kiss, laying hands on certain people to commission them for ministry, washing each other's feet, eating together. Running through all of that is this sense, as Paul put it, that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. When we take all of this together, we see the principle loud and clear. We are formed by what we do with our bodies and what happens to our bodies. Of course, we never quite lost sight of this. We still baptize. We still eat the bread and drink the cup when we gather for communion. We still sing. And yet, when it comes to spiritual formation, so much of our attention has focused on intellectual knowledge, getting more and more religious facts into our heads, explaining scripture, explaining theology. Now, of course, that's important, but just because I understand a text or a theological idea doesn't mean that that idea has become part of my identity, my way of being in the world. It doesn't mean that my heart has been captivated by the beauty of the Lord. And so our challenge is to find ways of drawing people into a holistic experience of the gospel. And that's going to involve looking for ways to engage the body, to get us up, to get us moving, to engage us, to engage the full range of sensory experience. There are endless possibilities for how to do that, but let me offer just a few ideas to get you thinking. Engaging people holistically might be as simple as drawing them into works of service in the community. In the early centuries of Christianity, when a person wanted to become a Christian, they would go through a period of training that sometimes lasted 3, 4, even more years. And during that time, they were mentored into the Christian way of life. They learned how to act like Christians, how to pray, how to treat other people, how to care for the poor, alongside of learning the creeds. And then once they had the practices down, they get the finer points of doctrine, and then they were baptized. Almost the opposite of how we've done it. As I look back on my own ministry, I realize that some of the most formative things we ever did as a church were like that. Helping to fix up a house for a poor elderly woman in our community as part of the Christmas in April program, pitching in to help one of our members move, showing up for a church workday, getting involved in building a Habitat for Humanity house. In those settings, new Christians and even folks who weren't yet Christians could jump in with more seasoned believers, and together we learned how Christians were supposed to think and act and live. But this might also involve finding ways in our small groups and our Bible classes to act on what we're learning. It might mean having us write or draw or act something out. I can remember being in a small group focusing on the story of creation in Genesis 2, where God took the dust of the earth and used it to fashion a human. After we had read the text and talked about it, we were each given a piece of clay and invited to create something with our clay, while music played softly in the background. It was at a time when I was about to make a major life transition into what felt like the great unknown. And so I decided to make a figure of a hiker holding a walking stick, gazing out into the future. Now, I'm no artist, but I'll never forget that magical moment when that thing in my hand went from being a lump of clay to what I could recognize as the faint outline of a person. For the first time, I had a visceral sense of what it meant for God to look out over creation and say, "It is good." And that sense has never left me. In her wonderful book, An Altar in the World, Barbara Brown Taylor invites us to consider how mundane physical acts and experiences can become sites where we encounter the presence of God. Walking, working in our garden, getting lost, even feeling pain. How these give us opportunities to practice God's presence in ways that take what we believe deep into our bones. And finally, in some cases, it might involve creating rituals, scripted performances through which we act out the things we believe or that we want to believe. Rituals have a unique power to take abstract ideas and make them concrete. And they also give us opportunities to act on ideas in ways that make them real in our consciousness. I'll never forget the time a friend of mine was struggling to forgive his father for things he had done. And he realized that the opportunity to actually sit down and work it out with his father might never come. And so he created a ritual. He brought a few of us together, he lit a candle, he read a letter he'd written to his father, and then he burned the letter. We prayed, and that was that. It was so simple, and yet such a powerful way of acting out and making real what he wanted so much to be able to do, to let go of his anger. But however we do it, this is our challenge, to find ways of teaching and nurturing discipleship that are holistic and embodied. In Psalm 73, the psalmist writes of finding his faith slipping away. He looked around and it just looked like the forces of evil were gaining the upper hand. My feet were slipping, he said. I had nearly lost my foothold, for I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. He began to question the worth of his own struggle to do the right thing. He found himself becoming cynical. It's all been a waste of time. But then, in a flash, everything changes. He recovers himself. How? He doesn't think about it. He doesn't try to understand it all. He doesn't try to come up with some rational explanation that will make it all make sense again. Instead, here's what he says. I entered the sanctuary of God. He got up on his feet and he took his body back into the holy place, back into that space where he had worshiped so many times before. There was something about that space, something about the colors and textures and smells and sounds and the feel of the floor under his feet. It all took him back to what he believed and to what he knew to be true. As for me, he concludes, it's good to be near God. This is our challenge, to invite the people we serve into spiritual practices that engage their whole selves, not just their minds, but also their bodies, all of their senses. For only then will the truths of the gospel take root in their hearts and become imprinted on their very personality. Thank you for listening.